The smell of cinnamon and vanilla from my freshly baked snickerdoodles filled the kitchen as I arranged them on my grandmother's blue ceramic plate, the same one I'd used for special occasions since my children were small. Sunlight streamed through the lace curtains, casting delicate shadows across the wooden table where I'd placed little paper napkins decorated with cartoon dinosaurs. My heart swelled with anticipation as I checked the clock for the third time in 5 minutes. 2:30. My grandchildren, Emma and Jake, would arrive any moment for our weekly baking afternoon, a tradition we'd maintained for over 2 years. The sound of car doors slamming in my driveway made me smooth my apron and hurry to the front window. Through the glass, I watched 8-year-old Emma bound up the walkway, her pigtails bouncing, while 6-year-old Jake trotted behind, clutching his stuffed elephant. But something felt different today. Instead of their usual excited chatter and race to my front door, they walked slowly, whispering to each other with serious expressions that seemed far too mature for their young faces. You're about to hear an unbelievable true story, so please like and subscribe. Drop your location in the comments. My name is Margaret Lewis, I'm 52 years old, and what happened next shattered everything I thought I knew about my relationship with my family. When I opened the door with my biggest smile, ready to sweep them into hugs that smelled like my lavender perfume, Emma looked up at me with cautious eyes. "Hi, Grandma," she said politely, but she didn't run into my arms like usual. Jake hung back, studying my face as if he was trying to solve a puzzle. "Are you feeling okay today, Grandma?" Jake asked in a small voice. "Daddy said we should ask you that." The question hit me like cold water. I knelt down to their level, my knees creaking against the hardwood floor of my entryway. "Of course I'm feeling fine, sweetheart. Why would you ask that?" Emma and Jake exchanged a look that made my stomach twist. "Daddy told us that sometimes grown-ups get confused when they get really old," Emma explained carefully, as if she'd rehearsed the words. "He said we should be extra nice to you, but maybe not believe everything you tell us because your brain might not work right anymore." The cookie plate slipped from my hands and clattered to the floor, sending snickerdoodles scattering across my kitchen tiles. My son David, their father, had actually told his children that I was losing my mind. At 52, the betrayal felt like a physical blow to my chest, making it hard to breathe. David Matthews, my 30-year-old son, stood in my doorway still wearing his navy business suit from his job at the insurance company. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his smile confident, but there was something calculating in his eyes that I'd never noticed before. When had my relationship with my own child become so strained that he would poison his children against me? "Mom, don't look so shocked," David said, stepping into my living room without being invited. "The kids are just being cautious. You have been saying some pretty strange things lately." "Strange things?" I stood up slowly, my hands shaking as I brushed cookie crumbs from my floral dress. "Like what exactly?" David settled into my burgundy armchair like he owned it, crossing his legs casually. "Well, last week you insisted that Dad called you, but he's been dead for 3 years. And you keep telling the kids stories about our old house that don't match reality. Emma came home confused because you told her we had a swing set in the backyard, but we never did." My mouth fell open. Every word he'd just said was a complete lie. My husband Thomas had called me last week from his business trip to Portland, and we absolutely had a wooden swing set that Thomas built himself when David was 7. I had photographs to prove it, but as I looked at my grandchildren's worried faces, I realized they were already starting to believe their father's version of events over mine. "David, that's not true, and you know it," I said firmly. But Emma stepped closer to her father's chair, as if she needed protection from her supposedly confused grandmother. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting longer shadows across my living room floor, and suddenly my own home felt foreign and unwelcoming. Thomas Lewis, my husband of 28 years, chose that moment to walk through the front door, carrying grocery bags, his silver hair slightly messed from the October wind. At 55, Thomas still had the broad shoulders and steady presence that had attracted me in college, and his warm brown eyes immediately assessed the tension in the room. "What's going on here?" Thomas asked, setting down the bags and looking between David's smug expression and my pale face. "Margaret, you look like you've seen a ghost." "Thomas, thank goodness you're here," I said, relief flooding through me. "David has been telling Emma and Jake that I'm getting old and confused, and he's lying about our family history. Tell them about the swing set you built in our backyard on Maple Street." Thomas's eyebrows drew together as he studied our son's face. "Of course I remember that swing set. Took me 3 weekends to build it properly, and you nearly broke your arm when you insisted on testing it first." He turned to David with a stern expression I remembered from David's teenage years. "Why would you tell the children something like that never happened?" But David's confident smile never wavered. "Dad, I think you might be getting confused too. We're all getting older, and sometimes memories get mixed up with things we wished had happened." The audacity of his words left me speechless. He was gaslighting both of us, making us question our own memories and experiences. But why? What could David possibly gain from making his children distrust their grandparents? Emma tugged on David's sleeve, her voice barely above a whisper. "Daddy, are Grandma and Grandpa both getting sick in their brains?" Before either Thomas or I could respond, my best friend, Carol Peterson, knocked on the still open front door, her arms full of fabric samples from the quilting store where we'd spent the morning choosing materials for our next project. Carol's silver curls were perfectly styled despite the wind, and her bright purple sweater added warmth to her 60-year-old face. She'd been my closest friend for 15 years, ever since we met in a community college art class, and her timing couldn't have been more perfect. "Margaret, I hope you don't mind me stopping by, but you left your purse in my car and I thought you might need it," Carol called out cheerfully before noticing the tense atmosphere in my living room. Her smile faded as she took in Emma and Jake's worried expressions and David's defensive posture. "Oh my, did I interrupt something important?" "Carol, actually, your timing is perfect," I said, my voice stronger now that I had another witness. "David here has been telling his children that Thomas and I are getting old and confused, and he's denying things about our family history that he knows are true. You remember the swing set Thomas built when David was little, don't you?" Carol's sharp blue eyes narrowed as she looked at David with obvious disapproval. "Of course I remember that swing set. I helped Thomas paint it yellow and green, and my own children played on it dozens of times when we visited. David, you loved that swing so much that your parents had to drag you inside for dinner every night." She set down her fabric samples and crossed her arms. "What's this really about?" The room fell silent except for the sound of wind chimes on my back porch and the distant hum of traffic on our quiet residential street. David's confident mask slipped for just a moment, and I caught a glimpse of something desperate in his expression. Emma and Jake looked back and forth between the adults, clearly overwhelmed by the conflicting stories they were hearing. Thomas moved closer to me, his hand finding mine and squeezing gently. The familiar comfort of his calloused fingers against my palm steadied my racing heart, but questions swirled through my mind like autumn leaves in a storm. How long had David been planning this systematic attack on my credibility? What had I done to deserve such treatment from my own son? And most importantly, what would happen to my relationship with Emma and Jake if I couldn't prove that David was lying. The kitchen timer chose that moment to beep, reminding me that I'd put a second batch of cookies in the oven before the children arrived. The ordinary sound felt surreal against the backdrop of this family crisis, but it also gave me an idea. Somewhere in my house, I had proof that would expose David's lies once and for all. The trap I'd missed finally sprang shut. I turned toward the kitchen, my mind racing as the timer continued its insistent beeping. "I need to get those cookies before they burn," I said, but my real purpose was different. In my bedroom closet, tucked away in an old photo album, I had pictures from David's childhood that would prove once and for all that the swing set existed. "Grandma, can we help with the cookies?" Emma asked, her voice small and uncertain. "Of course, sweetheart," I replied, grateful for the chance to speak with her and Jake away from their father's influence. As we walked toward the kitchen, I heard Thomas's voice behind us, low and measured. "David, I don't understand what's happening here, but your mother deserves better than this." "Dad, I'm trying to protect the kids." David's voice carried a sharp edge I'd never heard before. "You and Mom have been forgetting things, mixing up stories. Last month, Mom told Emma that great-grandpa fought in World War I when he was clearly too young for that." I froze in the kitchen doorway, my hand on the oven mitt. That detail stopped me cold because David was right about that particular mistake. I had confused the wars when talking to Emma about her great-grandfather. The realization hit me like a physical blow. If I'd been wrong about that, what if there were other things I'd gotten mixed up? Emma tugged at my sleeve. "Grandma, the cookies?" I pulled the golden brown cookies from the oven, my hands trembling slightly. Behind us, Thomas and David's conversation continued, their voices growing more heated. "One mistake doesn't mean your mother is confused about everything," Thomas was saying. "That swing set was real, David. I built it with my own hands." "Maybe you think you remember building it, Dad, but memories can play tricks on people." Jake looked up at me with worried eyes. "Grandma, I don't understand why everyone's arguing." I knelt down to his level, choosing my words carefully. "Sometimes grown-ups disagree about things that happened long ago, sweetheart. But that doesn't mean anyone is lying or trying to hurt anyone else." "But Dad said you might tell us stories that aren't true," Emma whispered, glancing toward the living room where the argument continued. The words stung because they came from my granddaughter's innocent mouth, but they also sparked something fierce inside me. I stood up, decision made. "Emma, Jake, I want to show you something. Stay here and let these cookies cool." I walked back into the living room where David and Thomas faced each other like two bulls preparing to charge. "David, I need to ask you something directly," I said, my voice cutting through their argument. "Are you genuinely concerned about my memory, or is something else going on here?" David's jaw tightened. "Mom, I've been watching you and Dad struggle with little things, forgetting names, repeating stories, getting dates mixed up. I don't want Emma and Jake to be confused or scared when you tell them things that might not be accurate." "But I haven't been forgetting things any more than usual," I protested. "Everyone makes mistakes occasionally. Last week you called me Michael twice during our phone conversation," David said quietly. "Michael was your brother, who died 10 years ago." The kitchen suddenly felt too warm. I had called David by my deceased brother's name, not once but twice during that conversation. The memory came flooding back, along with the embarrassed way I'd tried to cover up the mistake. Thomas reached for my hand, but I pulled away, needing space to think. "That was just once," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "And you asked me 3 times in one afternoon when Jake's birthday was," David continued, his tone gentler now, but no less determined. "Mom, I love you. But I can't let you accidentally confuse the kids about family history or other important things. Emma appeared in the doorway, her young face creased with concern. Daddy, what's wrong with Grandma? The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire ready to snap. Emma's question echoed in my mind, and I watched as 3 generations of our family stood frozen in this moment of painful truth-telling. There's nothing wrong with Grandma, sweetheart, I said finally, my voice steadier than I felt. Your daddy is just worried about me, the same way I used to worry about him when he was little and got sick. Emma stepped closer, her small hand finding mine. But you're not sick, are you, Grandma? I looked down at her upturned face, then at Jake, who had joined his sister in the doorway, cookie crumbs still on his chin. How do you explain to children that growing older means your mind sometimes plays tricks on you, that names and dates can slip away like water through cupped hands? Sometimes I get things mixed up, I admitted. Like when I called your daddy by Uncle Michael's name. That wasn't because I forgot who your daddy was, but because my brain was thinking about Uncle Michael at the same time. David's expression softened slightly, but his stance remained rigid. Mom, it's more than just mixing up names occasionally. I've been what, David? I interrupted, surprising myself with the sharpness in my voice. Forgetting that Jake's birthday is next month? Yes, I asked you 3 times because I want to make sure I get the date right for his party. I want to be prepared, not confused on the day. Thomas cleared his throat. David, your mother has been under a lot of stress lately. We both have. Maybe that's affecting her memory more than usual. What kind of stress? Emma asked, her grip tightening on my hand. I glanced at Thomas, then back at David. We hadn't told the children about Thomas's recent diagnosis, about the sleepless nights I'd been having, about the way worry had been eating at both of us for weeks. Adult worries, sweetheart, I said carefully. Nothing for you to be concerned about. But David was studying both Thomas and me now, his analytical mind clearly working. What aren't you telling me? What's really going on here? Jake stepped forward, his young voice cutting through the tension. Grandpa, you look sad. Are you sick? Thomas knelt down to Jake's level, his weathered hands gentle as he placed them on his grandson's shoulders. I've had some health concerns lately, buddy. Nothing dangerous, but it's been worrying your grandmother and me. Is that why you seem more forgetful lately, Mom? David asked, his voice losing some of its earlier hardness. Because you've been worried about Dad? I nodded, feeling a weight lift slightly from my chest. When I can't sleep at night, when I'm thinking about doctor's appointments and test results? Yes, it affects how clearly I think during the day. But David, that doesn't mean I'm going to fill these children's heads with nonsense. Emma looked between all the adults, her young face serious beyond her years. So, Grandma isn't getting confused because she's old? She's just worried about Grandpa? Partly, yes, I said. But your daddy isn't wrong to be concerned about me. Sometimes when people get older, they do start forgetting things more often. I just don't think I'm there yet. David ran a hand through his hair, the same gesture he'd used since he was a teenager when he felt uncertain. I'm sorry, Mom. Maybe I overreacted. It's just, when you called me Michael, you seemed so sure that's who you were talking to. It scared me. It scared me too, I admitted. But scaring each other isn't going to help anything. And telling the children not to believe things I say isn't fair to them or to me. Jake tugged on Thomas's sleeve. Grandpa, what kind of sick are you? Thomas looked up at me, silently asking permission. I nodded, knowing these children were old enough to handle the truth, especially if we presented it carefully. I have something called diabetes, Jake. It means my body doesn't process sugar the way it should. Your grandmother has been helping me learn new ways to eat and take care of myself. Will you be okay? Emma asked, her voice small. With proper care and your grandmother's help, yes, I should be fine, Thomas said. But it's been a big change for both of us, and change can be stressful. David sat down heavily in his father's recliner. Why didn't you tell me about the diagnosis? I could have helped, could have understood better what was going on. Because you have your own life, your own worries with work and the children, I said. We didn't want to burden you with something we could handle ourselves. But you couldn't handle it all by yourselves, David pointed out. It was affecting you, Mom, and I misunderstood why. Emma had been listening intently to our conversation, and now she looked directly at her father. Daddy, does this mean you're going to start believing Grandma again? David's cheeks reddened slightly. I never stopped believing Grandma, Em. I just got worried that she might accidentally tell you wrong information about important things. But if she's just worried and not actually confused, then she can still tell us stories and family history and stuff? Jake asked. Yes, David said, though I could hear the slight hesitation in his voice. But maybe we all need to be more careful about checking facts together, especially about dates and names and things like that. I bristled at the suggestion, but Thomas caught my eye and shook his head slightly. This was progress, his expression seemed to say. Don't push too hard. That's reasonable, I said carefully. As long as it goes both ways. You've gotten some family stories wrong over the years too, David. Like what? Emma asked with sudden interest. Well, I said, settling into my chair and pulling Emma closer. Your daddy once told you that I made him walk 5 miles to school every day in the snow? But we lived exactly 6 blocks from his elementary school, and I drove him whenever the weather was bad. Jake giggled. Daddy, did you lie? I exaggerated, David said with a sheepish grin. Sometimes stories get bigger in the telling. See? I said to my grandchildren. Everyone's memory plays tricks sometimes. The important thing is that we love each other and try to figure out the truth together. Emma nodded solemnly, but then her expression grew troubled again. Grandma, what if you do start getting more confused as you get older? What happens then? The question hit me like a physical blow, because it was the same one that kept me awake at night. What if David was right? What if these small lapses were the beginning of something bigger, something that would eventually steal away not just my memories, but my ability to be the grandmother these children deserved? Then we'll face that together too, I said finally. All of us, as a family. But even as I spoke the words, I could see doubt flickering in David's eyes, and I wondered if the damage to our relationship was already deeper than any of us wanted to admit. The silence that followed my words stretched uncomfortably long. Thomas cleared his throat and stood up, walking over to look out the front window. You know, he said without turning around, I've been thinking about something. Margaret, you mentioned that you've been having trouble sleeping, worrying about these memory lapses. Some, I admitted, though it was more than some. The nights had become my enemy, filled with anxiety about every forgotten word, every misplaced item. Maybe that's part of the problem, Thomas continued, turning back to face us. When you don't sleep well, your mind doesn't work as clearly during the day. It's a cycle. David leaned forward in his chair. Thomas has a point, Mom. When was the last time you had a really good night's sleep? I tried to remember, but the weeks seemed to blur together. I don't know. It's been a while. Emma, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. Grandma, do you lie awake thinking about scary things? Her directness caught me off guard. Sometimes, sweetheart. Like what kind of scary things? Jake asked, moving closer to his sister. I looked at David, unsure how much honesty was appropriate. He nodded slightly, encouraging me to continue. Well, I worry that maybe Daddy is right about me getting confused, and I worry that if I really am having problems with my memory, I might not be able to take care of myself anymore. Or that I might say something wrong to you two and upset you. But Grandma, Emma said earnestly, if you're lying awake, worrying about forgetting things, then you're probably too tired to remember things the next day. It's like when I don't sleep before a test, and then I can't think of answers. I definitely know. The simplicity of her observation hit me harder than any of the complex explanations the adults had offered. You're absolutely right, Em. David was staring at his daughter with something approaching awe. Em, that's really insightful. It's just logical, Emma said with a shrug. If your brain is tired, it doesn't work as good. As well, I corrected automatically, then caught myself. Sorry, honey. You're absolutely right about the tired brain part. Jake had been thinking hard about something, his brow furrowed in concentration. Grandma, what if we made a deal? What kind of deal, sweetie? What if you promise to tell us when you're worried about forgetting something, and we promise to help you remember without making you feel bad about it? I felt tears prick at my eyes. That sounds like a wonderful deal, Jake. Thomas sat back down, a small smile playing at his lips. These kids are pretty smart, Margaret. They are, David agreed, but I could hear something else in his voice. Uncertainty, maybe, or guilt. Emma noticed it too. Daddy, you look sad. David ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized from his childhood when he was struggling with something difficult. I'm not sad, exactly. I'm just thinking about how I handled this whole situation. You were trying to protect us, Jake said matter-of-factly. But maybe you were protecting us from the wrong thing. What do you mean? David asked. Jake looked at his sister, then back at his father. You were trying to protect us from Grandma maybe telling us wrong information. But really, you made us not trust her at all. And that felt worse than if she had gotten a date wrong or something. Emma nodded vigorously. Yeah, because we love Grandma, and when you said she was confused, it made us feel like we were losing her even though she was right there. David's face went pale. I never thought about it that way. The thing is, Daddy, Emma continued, her voice gentle but serious. We know Grandma loves us. So even if she accidentally tells us the wrong year something happened, we know she's not trying to trick us or anything. But when you told us not to believe her, it felt like you were saying she might lie to us on purpose. Which made everything confusing, Jake added. Because we know Grandma doesn't lie. I watched my son absorb his children's words, seeing emotions play across his face that I hadn't seen since he was their age and trying to work through a problem that felt too big for him. You're both right, David said finally. I made a mistake, a big one. But you can fix it, Emma said with the confidence that only children possess about such things. I hope so, David replied, but he was looking at me when he said it, and I could see that he wasn't entirely sure forgiveness would be that simple. Thomas, who had been listening to this exchange with growing concern, suddenly sat forward. David, can I ask you something directly? Of course. Are you still worried that your mother is developing dementia or some other cognitive problem? The question hung in the air like a challenge. David looked at his children, then at me, then back at Thomas. Honestly? Yes, I am still worried about that. The words hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd suspected this was still lurking beneath the surface. I felt my chest tighten, that familiar sensation of the world tilting slightly off its axis that I'd been experiencing more often lately. Was that what David was seeing? Was that what made him think I was losing my mind? Dad, Emma said softly, her voice carrying a tremor that made my heart ache. What does that mean exactly? What kind of worried? David rubbed his face with both hands, and I could see him struggling with how much to share with his children. I've noticed some things with Grandma lately. Sometimes she repeats stories, or she'll forget something we just talked about. And there was that incident with Mrs. Patterson from next door. What incident? Thomas asked, his voice careful and controlled. Mom told the kids that Mrs. Patterson had painted her house purple, but it's actually blue, a very obvious blue. And when I corrected her, she got defensive and insisted it was purple. David looked at me apologetically. It wasn't just that you were wrong, Mom. It was how certain you were about it and how you reacted when I pointed out the mistake. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, partly from embarrassment, but mostly from a growing frustration. David, Mrs. Patterson did paint her house purple. It's a blue purple, but it definitely has purple tones to it. Just because you see it as blue doesn't mean I'm hallucinating. Mom, it's clearly blue. I've lived on this street for 15 years. I know what color blue is. And I've been looking at colors for 73 years. I shot back, then immediately regretted the sharpness in my tone. The children were watching this exchange with wide eyes, and I could see confusion and worry creeping back into their faces. Thomas held up a hand gently. Okay, let's pause on the house color debate for a moment. David, I'm hearing that you're concerned about your mother's memory and perception. That's actually not uncommon for adult children to worry about. But I'm curious about something else. Have you talked to your mother about these concerns directly, outside of correcting her in front of the kids? David shifted uncomfortably. Not really. I mean, how do you have that conversation? Hey, Mom, I think you might be losing your mind. It seemed kinder to just manage the situation quietly. By telling us not to believe her, Jake said, and I could hear disappointment in his young voice. I was trying to protect everyone, David said defensively. If Mom is having cognitive issues, I didn't want you kids to be confused or scared. And I didn't want to embarrass Mom by confronting her directly about things that might not be her fault. I stared at my son, seeing him clearly perhaps for the first time in months. He looked tired, stressed, and genuinely conflicted. This wasn't malicious behavior, I realized. This was fear. He was afraid of losing me before I was actually gone, and that fear had made him do something that hurt all of us. David, I said quietly, you've been carrying this worry alone, haven't you? He nodded, not meeting my eyes. Ever since Dad died, I've been watching you so carefully. Maybe too carefully. Every time you pause to remember a word, or mention someone's name twice in one conversation, or get a detail slightly wrong, I wonder if this is the beginning of something bigger. Emma moved closer to her father on the couch. Daddy, sometimes I tell the same story twice in one day because I forget who I already told it to. And last week I called my teacher Mrs. Johnson when her name is Mrs. Johnston. Does that mean I'm getting sick too? Of course not, sweetheart. That's just normal human stuff. Then maybe Grandma's doing normal human stuff too, Jake said logically. Thomas nodded approvingly at the children. Jake makes a good point. David, grief and hypervigilance often go hand in hand. When we've lost someone important, we sometimes become overly focused on protecting the people we have left, even from things that might not actually be threats. But what if I'm right? David asked, and his voice cracked slightly. What if something is happening to her, and I'm not doing enough to help? What if by not addressing it directly, I'm making things worse? The vulnerability in my son's voice broke something open in my chest. I got up from my chair and walked over to sit beside him, taking his hand in both of mine. David, look at me, I said gently. He raised his eyes to meet mine, and I could see unshed tears there. If there comes a time when I need help with my memory or my thinking, I need to know that you'll talk to me about it honestly and with love, not behind my back to protect me from my own life. But what if you can't understand what's happening? What if you get angry or scared? Then we'll figure it out together. But right now, today, I'm still me. I still deserve to be trusted and respected and believed when I tell my grandchildren stories. Even if I occasionally get a detail wrong or see Mrs. Patterson's house as more purple than you do. Thomas leaned forward slightly. David, there's something else to consider here. By preemptively discrediting your mother with the children, you may have actually created more confusion and distress than any occasional mixed-up detail would have caused. David looked at his children, both of whom were now sitting close to him, Emma's small hand resting on his arm. Is that true? Did my way of handling this make things worse for you? It made us feel like we couldn't trust anybody, Jake said simply. Because if Grandma was wrong but didn't know it, and you were telling us not to believe her, then how could we know who was right about anything? And it felt like you thought we were too little to handle Grandma making mistakes, Emma added. But we're not too little. We know nobody's perfect. I felt a surge of pride in these wise, compassionate children, followed immediately by a wave of sadness for all the worry they'd been carrying because of this situation. You're both absolutely right, David said, pulling them closer. I made this much more complicated and scary than it needed to be. The question now, Thomas said carefully, is how do we move forward? David, you still have concerns about your mother's cognitive health. That's not going to disappear overnight, and it's not necessarily wrong to have those concerns. But the way you've been handling them hasn't worked for anyone. David nodded slowly. So what do I do? How do I tell the difference between normal aging and something that actually needs attention? How do I stop being so afraid that I'm hurting everyone? Maybe, I said quietly, you start by trusting that I know myself well enough to tell you if I'm worried about my own mind. And maybe we agree that if either of us has concerns, we'll talk about them honestly with each other, not around each other. That sounds reasonable, David said. But Mom, what if there comes a point where you don't realize something is wrong? I've read that sometimes people with dementia don't know they have it. The question hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken fears. I could see Thomas watching us carefully, and the children were listening with the intense focus that kids bring to conversations they know are important, but don't fully understand. I suppose, I said slowly, we'll have to trust each other enough to have that conversation when and if it becomes necessary. But David, we can't live our lives in fear of what might happen someday. And you can't take away my voice now because you're worried you might lose it later. David was quiet for a long moment, processing everything. Finally, he looked up at Thomas with a question that made my stomach clench with anxiety. Thomas, you've known my mother for years. Have you noticed anything concerning about her memory or thinking lately? I need an outside perspective, someone who isn't her son and isn't afraid of hurting her feelings. The room fell silent as we all waited for Thomas's answer, and I realized that his response might change everything about how this conversation would end. My heart hammered against my ribs as I waited for Thomas's response. This felt like a moment of truth that could either vindicate everything I'd been saying or confirm David's worst fears. I found myself holding my breath, suddenly terrified of what my oldest friend might reveal. Thomas looked thoughtful, his gaze moving between David and me before settling on his hands folded in his lap. The silence stretched long enough that I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking, each second feeling like an eternity. "I've been wondering if you'd ask me that," Thomas said finally. "And I've been thinking about it a lot, especially since your mother told me what's been happening." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "David, I'm going to be completely honest with you, because I think that's what everyone needs right now." My stomach dropped. The careful way he was speaking, the serious tone. It felt like he was preparing to deliver bad news. I gripped the arm of my chair, bracing myself for him to confirm that, yes, he'd noticed me forgetting things, getting confused, losing track of conversations. "Your mother is sharper now than most people half her age," Thomas continued, and I felt a rush of relief so intense it made me dizzy. "She remembers details about conversations we had weeks ago. She catches references to books and movies that would go right over most people's heads. When we play chess, she still beats me more often than not, and trust me, that game requires clear thinking." David's expression shifted, confusion replacing the tense expectation. "But you haven't been around her as much as I have. Maybe you just haven't seen—" "Actually, I have been around her quite a bit," Thomas interrupted gently. "We have coffee at least twice a week. We go to the library together, attend lectures at the community center, play cards with other friends. I see her in all kinds of situations, David, including ones where she's tired or stressed or dealing with multiple tasks at once." I watched my son's face as this information sank in. I could see him processing the fact that I had a full social life he knew almost nothing about, that there were people who interacted with me regularly and saw me as completely competent. "The only changes I've noticed in your mother over the past few years," Thomas continued, "are positive ones. She seems more confident in expressing her opinions, more willing to try new things. Last month, she started taking a pottery class, and she talks about it with such enthusiasm." Does that sound like someone who's confused or declining? "A pottery class?" David looked at me with surprise. "You didn't tell me about that." "You didn't ask," I said quietly. "And lately, when I do share things with you, you respond as if I'm either making them up or getting the details wrong. It becomes easier to just not share." The hurt on David's face was immediate and genuine. "Mom, I had no idea you felt like you couldn't talk to me about your life." "It's been gradual," I admitted. "At first, I thought you were just distracted when you'd correct me about small things, or look skeptical when I told you about something that happened. But over time, it started to feel like you'd already decided I couldn't be trusted to get anything right." Emma, who had been listening intently to this adult conversation, suddenly spoke up. "Grandma, what kind of pottery do you make?" The question was so innocent and enthusiastic that it made me smile despite the heavy emotions in the room. "Mostly bowls and mugs so far. I made one with a terrible lopsided handle that I absolutely love because it reminds me that imperfection can be beautiful too." "Can we see it sometime?" Jake asked. "Of course you can. I'd love to show you my little pottery corner in the spare room." I looked at David. "I set up a space where I can practice between classes." "I would have shown you before, but I wasn't sure you'd be interested." David ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I recognized from his childhood when he was overwhelmed. I feel like I've been missing everything that actually matters. I've been so focused on watching for signs of decline that I've completely missed signs of you thriving. But why were you so worried in the first place? Thomas asked. Did something specific happen that triggered these concerns? David was quiet for a moment, and I could see him thinking back. I think it started when she forgot about Jake's soccer game. She'd never missed one before, and when I called to ask where she was, she seemed genuinely confused about what day it was. I remembered that incident clearly now. David, that was the day after I'd been in the emergency room all night with Mrs. Henderson from next door. She'd fallen and didn't have anyone else to call. I'd gotten maybe 2 hours of sleep, and I was completely exhausted. You were in the ER all night? David stared at me. Why didn't you call me? It was a Tuesday night. You had that big presentation on Wednesday morning that you'd been stressed about for weeks. I didn't want to worry you when there was nothing you could do anyway. So instead of seeing that your mother had spent the night helping a neighbor in crisis, you saw only that she'd missed Jake's game and seemed confused, Thomas observed gently. And once you started looking for problems, I started finding them everywhere, David finished, even when they weren't really problems at all. The weight of this realization seemed to settle over him heavily. He looked at his children, then at me, with an expression of such regret that it made my heart ache. I've been such a fool, he said quietly, and I've hurt everyone I care about most because of it. But as we sat there in this moment of apparent breakthrough, I noticed something in David's expression that worried me. There was still a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, and I had the unsettling feeling that despite everything we'd discussed, he wasn't entirely convinced. The way he kept glancing between Thomas and me suggested he was still processing, still questioning, and I wondered if one conversation would really be enough to undo months of suspicion and fear. Emma broke the silence, her voice small but determined. Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be really honest with me. David looked at his daughter, and I could see him bracing himself. Of course, sweetheart. What is it? When you told us Grandma was getting confused, and we shouldn't believe everything she says, did you actually think she had dementia or something? Or were you just... She paused, searching for the right words. Were you just mad at her about something else? The directness of the question seemed to catch David off guard. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, clearly struggling with how to respond. That's a very insightful question, Emma, Thomas said quietly. Sometimes when we're worried or frustrated, we don't always examine our own motives as carefully as we should. I wasn't mad at her, David said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. I was genuinely concerned about her memory, her judgment. Jake leaned forward, his expression serious. But Dad, you told us not to believe her stories. That's different from being worried about someone's memory. That's like saying she was lying or making things up. I watched David's face as Jake spoke, and I could see the exact moment when the full implications of his actions hit him. His face went pale, and he looked stricken. Oh God, he whispered. You're right, I did say that. I told you not to believe your grandmother's stories. He looked at me with horror. Mom, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize how that sounded, how that must have felt. But you meant it to sound that way, I said gently, not wanting to be cruel, but needing him to understand. David, when you told them I was confused, you wanted them to doubt me. The question is why? Thomas nodded encouragingly at me, then looked at David. Sometimes when we're feeling out of control in one area of our lives, we try to control other areas more tightly. It's a very human response, but it can be destructive. Are you saying I was trying to control my mother? David's voice had an edge to it now, and I recognized the defensive tone that meant we were approaching something he didn't want to examine. I'm not saying anything, Thomas replied calmly. I'm asking you to think about what might have been driving your behavior. Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like there might have been more going on than simple concern about memory issues. Emma was watching her father intently. Dad, remember when you got really upset about Grandma's pottery classes? You kept saying she was being impulsive and not thinking things through. But taking a pottery class isn't impulsive, it's just normal. And you were weird about her volunteering at the animal shelter too, Jake added. You said she was taking on too much and not being realistic about her capabilities. But she's only there like 4 hours a week. I could see David becoming increasingly uncomfortable as his children cataloged his objections to my activities. His hands were clenched in his lap, and that muscle in his jaw was working the way it did when he was fighting an internal battle. You're making it sound like I was trying to sabotage her, he said, his voice tight. That's not what I was doing. I was worried about her. Were you? Thomas asked quietly. Or were you worried about something else entirely? The room fell silent except for the sound of David's increasingly rapid breathing. I could see him struggling with something, some internal conflict that was causing him real distress. I don't know what you want me to say, he finally said, but his voice was strained. I want you to tell us the truth, Emma said, her voice stronger now. Because Grandma has been really sad, Dad. Like, really sad. And Jake and I have been confused and upset because we didn't know who to believe or what to think. So if there's something else going on, we need to know what it is. David looked around the room at all of us, and I could see him wavering on the edge of some revelation. But then his expression closed off again, and he shook his head. There's nothing else going on, he said. But even as he spoke the words, I could tell that none of us believed him, including David himself. Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying David with a thoughtful expression. David, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to really think before you answer. When you imagine your mother living her own life, making her own choices, being independent and happy, how does that make you feel? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I watched my son's face cycle through a series of emotions I couldn't quite read. But the silence stretched on too long, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Terrified, he admitted, and the raw honesty in that single word changed everything in the room. The word seemed to echo in the room, and I felt my heart break a little for my son. In that single admission, so much suddenly made sense. The constant hovering, the attempts to undermine my independence, the way he painted my normal activities as signs of decline. It wasn't about protecting me from the world. It was about protecting himself from losing me. Oh, David, I said softly, and I saw his shoulders tense as if bracing for judgment. Emma moved closer to her father on the couch. Dad? Terrified of what? David's hands were shaking now, and he pressed them flat against his knees to still them. Of her not needing me anymore. Of her building this whole life that doesn't include me. Of her... He stopped, swallowing hard. Of her being fine without me. Thomas nodded slowly, his expression gentle but focused. And if she's fine without you, what does that mean? It means I'm not a good son, David said, the words rushing out like he'd been holding them back for months. It means I failed at taking care of her when Dad died. It means she's moving on and I'm still stuck. and maybe I always was just the disappointment who couldn't measure up. I felt tears prick my eyes, but I forced myself to stay quiet. This was David's moment to finally voice what had been eating at him. Jake was staring at his father with wide eyes. "Dad, that's crazy." "You're like the most responsible person ever. You take care of everyone." "Do I?" David laughed bitterly. "Because it sure doesn't feel that way. When Dad died, I promised myself I'd look after Mom. But every time I turn around, she's doing something new, meeting new people, going places without telling me. And I know that's normal and healthy. But it feels like she's leaving me behind." "So you decided to make her feel crazy instead?" Emma asked, not unkindly, but with the directness that only a teenager could manage. David flinched. "I didn't mean for it to go that far. At first, I really was just worried about some of her decisions. But then when she'd tell you kids about her activities, and you'd be excited for her, it made me feel like the outsider, like everyone was moving forward except me." Thomas leaned forward slightly. "David, what would happen if you let your mother be independent and happy? Really let her, without trying to manage or control it?" "She might realize she doesn't need me anymore," David said, his voice small. "And then, what am I? Just the son who calls too much and worries too much and can't figure out his own life?" The pain in his voice was so raw that I couldn't stay silent anymore. "David, honey, you're my son. That's not contingent on me needing you to survive day-to-day life." He looked at me with eyes that seemed much younger than his 42 years. "But what if you forget about me? What if you get so busy with pottery and volunteering and whatever else that I become just an obligation? What if I call and you're annoyed because you have better things to do? Is that what you think of me?" I asked, genuinely hurt. "That I would just discard you the moment I don't need you to manage my life?" David's face crumpled slightly. "I don't know. Maybe. I mean, look at how much happier you seem when you're talking about your new activities. You light up in a way you never do when we're just having dinner or talking about regular stuff. It makes me think that your real life is happening somewhere else, with other people." Emma reached over and took her father's hand. "Dad, you know how you get excited when you finish a big project at work? That doesn't mean you love work more than us. It just means you're proud of something you accomplished." "It's the same thing with Grandma," Jake added, with the sort of clarity that surprised me. "She's excited because she's learning new things and helping animals. But that doesn't mean she doesn't want to have dinner with us anymore." Thomas was watching this exchange with the satisfied expression of someone seeing a breakthrough happen in real time. "David, what do you think would happen if you stopped trying to protect yourself by controlling your mother's narrative?" David was quiet for a long moment, still holding Emma's hand. "I don't know. I've been doing it for so long now. And I've probably screwed things up so badly with Mom that I don't know how to fix it." "You haven't screwed anything up that can't be fixed," I said firmly. "But David, I need you to understand something. When you tell your children that I'm confused or declining, it doesn't just hurt me. It hurts them too. They love me, and they've been worried sick thinking something was wrong with me." David looked at his children, really looked at them, and seemed to see their distress for the first time. "God, I didn't think about how it would affect you too. I was so caught up in my own fears." "We were scared, Dad," Emma said quietly. "We thought Grandma was getting sick, and we didn't know what to do. And then sometimes the things she told us didn't match what you said, and it made everything feel unstable." "Like we couldn't trust anyone," Jake added. "It was really hard." David closed his eyes and I could see him grappling with the full scope of what his actions had caused. When he opened them again, he looked directly at me. "Mom, I am so sorry. I know that doesn't fix it, but I need you to know that I never meant to hurt you or the kids. I was just scared of losing you, and I handled it in the worst possible way." I felt a flood of relief at finally hearing him acknowledge what had happened, but I also knew this was just the beginning. "I accept your apology, David, but we need to figure out how to move forward." "Because I can't live with the constant feeling that you're undermining me with your children." Thomas nodded approvingly. "That's exactly right. So, David, what are you going to do differently going forward?" David took a shaky breath. "I don't know yet. I mean, I know I need to stop questioning everything Mom does, and I need to stop making comments to Emma and Jake about her judgment. But I still don't know how to handle feeling left out of her life." "What if you asked to be included instead of trying to tear down what I'm doing?" I suggested. "You could come to one of my pottery classes sometime, or visit me when I'm volunteering at the shelter." "You'd want me there?" David asked, looking genuinely surprised. "Of course I would. David, I don't want you out of my life. I want you to be part of my life. But I need you to let me have a life to include you in." Emma squeezed her father's hand. "Dad, this is good. This is really good. But what happens when you get scared again? Because you probably will, right?" It was such a perceptive question that Thomas actually smiled. "That's very wise, Emma. David, what's your plan for the next time you feel that fear of being left behind?" David considered this seriously. "I guess I could call you directly, Mom, instead of just stewing about it or making sideways comments to the kids." "That would be a good start," I said. And David, maybe you could think about what's missing in your own life that makes you feel so dependent on being needed by me." The suggestion hung in the air, and I could see David processing it. But before he could respond, his phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it, and his expression shifted into something I couldn't quite read. "What is it?" Emma asked, noticing her father's sudden tension. David looked up at us, and I could see a familiar panic creeping back into his eyes. "It's my boss. He wants to meet with me first thing Monday morning. No explanation. Just, we need to talk." And just like that, I could see my son beginning to spiral again, his newfound insights about his behavior warring with a fresh wave of anxiety that threatened to undo all the progress we'd just made. I watched the color drain from David's face as he stared at his phone, and my heart sank. After all the progress we'd just made, I could practically see him retreating back into that panicked place where he made his worst decisions. "David," Thomas said firmly, "put the phone down for a moment." "But what if I'm getting fired?" David's voice cracked slightly. "What if they're laying people off? I have a mortgage, the kids' expenses." "Dad, breathe," Emma said, reaching over to touch his arm. "You don't even know what the meeting is about yet." "But why else would they be so cryptic?" David's breathing was getting shallow. And if I lose my job, I'll have to move back in with Mom, and she's finally getting her independence, and I'll ruin everything again." I could see exactly where this was heading. In his anxiety, David would start grasping for control wherever he could find it, and historically, that meant trying to manage me and my life because he felt powerless over his own. "Stop," I said, more sharply than I'd intended. "David, look at me." He raised his eyes from his phone, and I could see that familiar wild look creeping in. "This is exactly what we were just talking about," I continued. "You're scared about something in your own life, so you're already planning how it's going to affect me and my choices. Do you see that?" I'm not, David started, then stopped. I mean, I wasn't trying to. Yes, you were, Emma said gently. Dad, you literally just said you'd have to move back in with Grandma and that you'd ruin her independence. You're already making decisions about her life based on something that might not even be bad news. Thomas nodded approvingly. This is a perfect example of what we've been discussing. David, your anxiety about work is completely understandable. But notice how quickly you jumped to assuming the worst, and then immediately started thinking about how to control other people's situations instead of dealing with your own feelings. David put his head in his hands. I do it so automatically. I didn't even realize I was doing it until you pointed it out. That's actually progress, I said, surprised to find myself feeling more compassionate than frustrated. At least now you can catch yourself doing it. But what if I really do lose my job? David asked, looking up at me. Mom, I know you want your independence, but I might actually need help. The vulnerability in his voice caught me off guard. This was different from his usual controlling behavior. This was my son, genuinely scared, asking for support instead of demanding it. If you need help, we'll figure it out together, I said. But David, there's a huge difference between asking for help when you actually need it and trying to control my life because you're afraid you might need it. I don't understand the difference, David admitted. Thomas leaned forward. The difference is timing and respect. Right now, you don't actually have a problem yet. You have a meeting scheduled, but you're already planning how to rearrange other people's lives around a crisis that may not exist. And even if you did lose your job, Emma added, the conversation would be, Mom, I'm in trouble and I need help, not Mom, you need to change your life because I might be in trouble. David was quiet for a long moment, processing this. So what should I do right now? Because I feel like I'm going to crawl out of my skin waiting until Monday. Feel anxious, I said simply. You're allowed to be worried about a mysterious meeting with your boss. That's normal. You don't have to fix the anxiety by controlling everything around you. But how do I just sit with feeling this scared? David asked. You could try actually talking about it, Emma suggested, instead of bottling it up and then taking it out on Grandma sideways. I hate my job, David said suddenly, like the words had been pulled out of him. I've hated it for years. I'm miserable there every single day, but I was too scared to look for something else because what if I ended up with something worse? And now, maybe they're going to fire me anyway, and I'll have been miserable for nothing. The room went very quiet. I realized this was the most honest David had been about his own life in years. That sounds incredibly difficult, Thomas said softly. How long have you been feeling this way? Since right after my divorce, David admitted. But I couldn't quit because I had the kids to think about, and I couldn't take risks with their security. So I just stayed and got more and more resentful. Is that why you've been so focused on managing Mom's life? Emma asked. Because you felt like you couldn't control your own? David's face crumpled slightly. Maybe. Probably. Yes. I felt a wave of sadness for my son. All this time, I'd been so focused on his behavior toward me that I hadn't fully grasped how trapped and unhappy he felt in his own life. David, I said carefully, what if this meeting is actually good news? What if it's a promotion or a new project or something positive? I can't let myself think that, David replied. If I hope for something good and it turns out to be bad, I don't think I could handle the disappointment. So you assume the worst about everything to protect yourself? Thomas observed. But that means you're living in a constant state of bracing for disaster. Which is exhausting, Emma added. No wonder you've been trying to control everything else. You're running on pure anxiety. David nodded miserably. I don't know how to stop. You don't have to stop all at once, I said. But maybe you could start by not making any major decisions or assumptions until after your meeting on Monday. What if I can't sleep between now and then? What if I drive myself crazy worrying? Then you drive yourself crazy worrying, Thomas said matter-of-factly. But you don't drive everyone else crazy with your worrying. Before David could respond, Emma's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, and her expression shifted to one of concern mixed with confusion. What now? I asked, feeling a familiar dread creeping up my spine. Emma looked up at us, her face troubled. It's Jake. He says he needs to talk to all of us together. Right now. He says it's about something he's been keeping secret, and he can't keep it to himself anymore. The dread that settled in my stomach wasn't just about what Jake might have to say. It was the familiar weight of family secrets, of discovering that things weren't what they seemed, of realizing how much we didn't know about each other, despite being bound together by blood and shared history. What kind of secret? David asked, and I could hear the exhaustion in his voice. He'd already been wrung out by his own admissions, and now there was more to process. Emma was still staring at her phone. He didn't say, just that he's been carrying something for months and he can't do it anymore. He wants to meet at his apartment in an hour. I found myself thinking about patterns, about the way problems seem to cluster together in families. Here was David, finally admitting he'd been miserable and controlling because his own life felt so out of control. And now Jake, who we'd thought was doing well, had been keeping secrets that apparently weighed heavily enough to require a family meeting. Should we go? Thomas asked, looking at me specifically. The question felt loaded with more than just logistics. After everything that had happened today, after David's accusations about my mental state and the subsequent revelations about his own struggles, did we have the emotional bandwidth for another crisis? But then I thought about Jake, my grandson, carrying something alone for months. Whatever teenage drama or young adult problems he was facing, he'd reached the point where he needed his family. Even if that family was currently fractured and raw from our own confrontations. Of course we go, I said. He's asking for help. David ran his hands through his hair. What if it's something serious? What if he's in real trouble? Then we help him, Emma said simply. Just like we're trying to help each other right now. I watched David process this. The same man who'd been trying to manage and control every aspect of my life was now faced with the possibility that his own son had been managing and controlling information about his life. The irony wasn't lost on me, though I didn't think pointing it out would be helpful. I keep thinking I know what's going on with everyone, David said quietly. I thought I knew Mom was becoming confused and needed managing. I thought I had my job situation under control. I thought Jake was just being a normal college kid, but I don't actually know anything, do I? The vulnerability in his voice reminded me of when he was small, when he'd come to me with scraped knees or hurt feelings, trusting that I could fix whatever was wrong. Now he was 43, realizing that his attempts to fix everything had been based on assumptions rather than understanding. None of us know everything, I told him. That's why we have to keep talking to each other instead of making decisions for each other. Emma gathered her things. We should head over there. Traffic's going to be terrible at this time of day. As we prepared to leave, I felt a strange mixture of apprehension and relief. Apprehension about what Jake might reveal, but relief that he was choosing to trust us with whatever he'd been carrying alone. After the way this day had gone, with David's assumptions about my mental state and my own assumptions about his motivations. The idea that Jake was actively seeking communication rather than avoiding it felt like progress. In the car, the silence felt different than it had earlier. Less charged with unspoken resentments, more heavy with the weight of family love and the complexity that came with it. David sat in the passenger seat, periodically checking his phone as if the message from Jake might have changed or clarified itself. "Do you think he's okay?" he asked as we sat in traffic. "I think he will be," I said, though I had no way of knowing. "But David, whatever he tells us, we listen first before we try to fix it." He nodded, and I could see him actively fighting his instincts to prepare solutions for problems he didn't even understand yet. When we reached Jake's apartment building, Thomas squeezed my hand briefly before getting out of the car. It was a small gesture, but it reminded me that whatever we were walking into it together.